let's just start with Obama's approval. Nothing particularly surprising here. The reason we present that is partly just for the time series, but there's no reason to think it should go up or down, and there should be pretty much steady state, and that's what we find, that about a third of registered voters approve of his job. We know he's not popular in the state, and this certainly confirms it. The economy, this is some interesting numbers. We're beginning to see more and more perceptions of the national economy doing better, and the state economy is doing a little bit better too. That gap of about 20 points is interesting in that the national economy is actually doing collectively better than Tennessee's economy. And so what explains that is this next graph, which we've talked about in the past and it continues to pop up, is that measures of the national economy are really very much tied with one's partisanship. So Republicans and Tea Partiers in particular are not going to acknowledge that the national economy is doing well because that would be a tip of their hat, so to speak, to President Obama. That's just not happening. And we see this across the board, so that it used to be that you could ask people about the state of the economy and that would be, they would give their particular answer, but now it's all mixed up with partisanship. It's just yet another indication of the polarization that this country faces. But as you can see, that polarization doesn't affect state judgments. That is, it doesn't matter really what partisan group you're from, the state economy is getting the same kind of support of about 2/3 in each and every case. The stability here is really quite interesting. And just as a reminder, and again, most of you know this, is that we ask a party identification question, whether you're Democrat, Independent, Republican. And then we ask a second question later about whether you think of yourself as a Tea Party member. So that the Tea Party members could in fact be Democrats, Republicans, or Independents. For the most part, they are in fact Republicans, but we have that. And we've been asking about the Tea Party really, well, since the very first poll that we'd started in 2011, and it's been a very useful tool to have to be able to make some generalizations. Here's just a little bit of indication of the perception of the state economy by region, and this works out as it should. That is that the middle part of the state is in fact doing better, and you see that in particular Nashville area is doing really well, and we can just count the number of cranes in our city as evidence of the robust economy that's going on. So that those numbers give a little bit of face validity to the results and aren't necessarily surprising, but still worth noting. Here is the approval of Governor Haslam in the state legislature. Governor Haslam's approval in the last poll was at 70%. It's still very, very high standing at 67%. I would not in any way, shape, or form view this as a decline in his popularity. This is as much measurement error and just kind of white noise out there. You know, when he hit the 70%, I thought that was probably a little high and maybe got a little bit of a boost from kind of random noise. This one is still very high. So I think the broad point is however you want to slice it, the governor remains popular, and there's just stability in the state legislature's approval. The Tennessee senators, both Lamar Alexander and Bob Corker, they too remain quite stable in their approval ratings. Again, you can try to make a big deal about a 2-point move, but I certainly wouldn't. It's a sign of stability more than anything else. Here is approval by state leaders by partisanship. Again, one of the core slices, we always want to take a look at party ID. I think the most noteworthy thing here is that not only is Governor Haslam popular, but he is popular among Democrats. 60% of the Democrats in the state are approving of his performance. And the gap between the Democrats and the Republicans is really quite narrow, especially in this era of polarization. If you take a look at President Obama's approval by Democrats or Republicans, it's sometimes a 70-point shift. Here we're talking about a 15-point shift, really not very much at all. So that not only is the governor popular, but he's popular among all partisan groups, and those two things combined make him a unique figure within state politics across our 50 states. Here is priorities for Tennesseans over time for the state government. You can see again the economy remains the most important concern. It goes up a little bit from 40 to 44%. The other stuff seems to be reasonably stable. Again, we present this for the time series in context more than anything else. Here's a question we added because of all the controversy tied to Insure Tennessee, and our editorial, not editorial board, but our advisory board thought this was a good idea, that we would just ask explicitly, does the citizens of Tennessee, or registered voters in particular, think that the state legislature is focusing on, would you say, spending enough time on the issues you care about, or did not spend enough time? And you see quite dramatic results, that basically the public believes that the state legislature did not spend time on the issues that they care about. And this is true across partisan groups as well. Even Tea Partiers, 59-32. And again, remember, Tea Partiers constitute about 15% of our sample. True for independents, most true for Democrats, but again, the differences are not super dramatic. There was a general consensus out there, you could say, among all citizens that the state legislature was not focusing on the issues that the individuals in Tennessee care about. Okay, support for Insure Tennessee. It's popular. 64% of registered voters support Insure Tennessee, only 19% oppose. And as you see on the graph and on your packets, the remaining 13% are basically undecided. They're not sure one way or the other. This is a big shift. This is a 4-to-1 split. Well, no, that's not correct. 3-to-1, a little more than 3-to-1 favor versus oppose. These are pretty big numbers. But even more interesting is the partisan story. Democrats, of course, are the most supportive of it. That should come as no surprise. But Republicans, 49-28. Independents, 65-17, even Tea Partiers, 42-40. That particular result, I think, will surprise a lot of people. But again, you know, we have 15% of the state. There's a lot of people in there. And if you slice this further by income and you look at the people who are making below the average income in the state or the median income, the Tea Partiers, that proportion that supports it shoots up to 65% among Tea Partiers. So that income is playing part of the role. That is, if you're somebody who might in fact be able to get access to health care because you don't have access to it, which is going to be among the less well-off, there's even more support. So this is a story that we've found in previous polls as well. And also, this particular number is not out of line with previous questions we've asked about just whether Medicaid expansion should be taken on in the state. So this is part of a larger pattern, not something that's unique to this particular poll. So we also thought it would be interesting to ask simply whether citizens of this state wanted to have the state legislature vote up or down on Insure Tennessee. And the answer is overwhelmingly yes. 78% would like to see a vote. Only 15% believe that a vote is not needed. That's pretty strong. And again, when you break it down by party identification, all partisan groups, even Tea Partiers, even Republicans, overwhelmingly people, regardless of their partisan stripes, would like to see a vote on Insure Tennessee. And so this is not something that's tied up into partisanship. And we see so many other things, even just like judgments of the national economy, that are tied up into partisanship. So this is something that has across the board support. And now I'm going to turn over to Josh, the remaining slides.
Thanks. So in addition to asking about Insure Tennessee, we also asked about a bunch of other issues that were either talked about or that were considered by the state legislature. So one issue that the state legislature considered was the issue of guns and different regulations that could be lessened in different ways. And so here we asked about a bunch of different proposals that were at one point considered or talked about, and you can see what the support is across the various partisan groups. And so here, whether or not we should have a ban from anyone carrying a gun within 250 feet of a school. They should take the same places off-duty police, allow firearms in parks, and so forth. And what's kind of interesting, I think, is the contrast that you find between these results and the Insure Tennessee results, and the fact that the only group that's kind of overwhelmingly more supportive of the gun regulations that were actually passed by the legislature was the Tea Party. Even among the bills that were passed, there's not as much support for the issues that were talked about and that were passed as there is for Insure Tennessee. Another issue that was kind of talked about a little bit was support for gas tax, and not surprisingly, because the word tax is in the question, there's not a whole lot of overwhelming support for that among the population, especially among the Tea Party. So they're about 50% on average of the population oppose the gas tax, although a considerable amount kind of still haven't heard enough about that particular policy issue to make up their minds. Another issue revolves around education initiatives and the role that testing has in the policy making. So we wanted to get a sense about what registered voters thought about the different ways that tests could be used. And you can see here that most people thought the use of tests was teachers perform well in schools, particularly among those that have students, right, in the public schools. So there, if you had a student in the public school, 37% really wanted them to use the test as a way of improving teacher performance, whereas if you had no student, right, then you primarily thought about the test as a way to kind of accurately assess school performance overall, not so much necessarily help teachers in their mission. Another issue relates to kind of legalized marijuana, an issue that we've been kind of asking about for several polls for now. And here, the results are basically stable. There's been a slight uptick in the percent that support marijuana for medicinal use only, but the number who think that it should be opposed outright has roughly stayed about the same. And there's been a slight decline that says it should be legalized for personal use, but that's a small number, so there's not really any noticeable change that are there. This is true. There's some partisan divisions there in terms of the Republicans and the Tea Party, those who are most likely to say that should not be legal. But as you can see, that the support for the legalization for medicinal use is pretty stable across all the different groups in terms of Democrats, Republicans, Independents, and even among the Tea Party that are there. Another important issue that has been considered in Tennessee and elsewhere is so-called right to die legislation about whether or not terminally ill patients should be permitted to end their own lives. And here, this is the first time we asked about it, you see pretty considerable support for this. About 55% support some right for patients to end their own lives through a painless means if they request it. Only 39% oppose. And again, this is true generally across the partisan divide. You see Democrats and Independents are the most supportive of this provision, but even members of the Tea Party, 58% support a right to die, and for Republicans, it's kind of more evenly split, about 47% favor and only 45% oppose. So again, this is an initiative that's been talked about that has pretty robust support across the different partisan groups. We asked a different way to kind of to dive a little bit deeper into this, to kind of think about the different ways that this could manifest itself in terms of how much consent is needed and what kind of restrictions might there be on the implementation of right to die legislation. And basically the same conclusion holds. Basically, 2/3 support some version of a right to die of various capacities in terms of how much consent should be allowed, and only about 31% of registered voters in the state oppose right to die legislation. Right? And again, there's not a whole lot of differences across partisanship for this as well. So this is kind of, again, there seems to be generally broad consensus in public opinion among registered voters about right to die legislation and what that means for the patients involved. Just a couple of other questions. We asked about support for making the Bible a state book. In some sense, this is a sanity test for our poll to kind of make sure what do we get. And sure enough, you can see that there's pretty robust support among the registered voters for making the Bible the officially recognized state book, especially among members of the Tea Party. Democrats are not as enthusiastic about that possibility, but still 50% of Democrats would support that proposition. Police cameras, another issue that's been in the news nationally. And so here again, there's widespread support among registered voters in Tennessee for requiring on-duty members of the police to have small body cameras while they're kind of policing. And if you break this down by partisanship, you get exactly the same results. There's no real great differences among the different groups about support for requiring some kind of cameras on police officers. And the final thing that we're going to talk about today is, well, whether or not to repeal motorcycle helmet laws. And again, like the instance with police cameras, the public is pretty unified in its view on this issue, that they oppose overwhelmingly, right, 75% to 22%, an attempt to repeal the helmet law and allow motorcycle riders above the age of 21 to basically ride their motorcycles without helmets. So again, on some issues here, we can see a very clear, consistent message of what the public thinks. Others, there's a little bit more divisions, and it'll be interesting to see how this plays out going forward.